Ethan Brooks had never considered himself the type of man who would move to a small, tightly knit community tucked away from the sprawling chaos of city life. But circumstances and a yearning for change had led him to do exactly that. For nearly 15 years he had lived and worked in the heart of downtown Boston, carving out a reputation as a meticulous and creative architect capable of breathing new life into neglected structures. His days had been filled with endless deadlines, client meetings that stretched well into the night, and a constant parade of development projects that left little room for anything resembling peace. When his father passed unexpectedly, leaving him with a modest inheritance and a gnawing sense of how fleeting time could be, Ethan had begun to reevaluate everything. He realized how little he had invested in himself, how little of his professional success translated into something personal and enduring. That was when he decided to buy a house of his own, one that could serve not only as a home, but as a reflection of the skills he had honed for so many years. He wanted something that would require patience and care, something that might challenge him beyond the sterile blueprints of urban redevelopment. He wanted a legacy. After months of searching, he found it. A weathered but striking colonial-style house on the edge of a tree-lined cul-de-sac in a quiet, affluent suburb just outside the city. Built in the early 1900s, the house still retained much of its original character, from its intricate crown molding to the grand, slightly curved staircase that greeted visitors upon entering the foyer. Yet it was also in clear need of restoration. The paint was peeling in places, the roof had sagged in one corner, and the hardwood floors bore decades of wear. Where others might have seen only expense and inconvenience, Ethan saw possibility. He envisioned an extensive renovation that would modernize the infrastructure while preserving the historic details, a balance of old and new that could turn the house into something truly special. The surrounding neighborhood appeared pristine, with manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, and neighbors who waved politely as they jogged by or pulled into their driveways. It was a place where Ethan believed he might finally find the stability and quiet he craved after years of relentless professional pressure. On his first day in the house, Ethan spent hours walking through each room, sketching out ideas in his notebook as the late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows. He made a mental list of priorities: repair the roof, replace outdated wiring, refinish the floors, and eventually open up the kitchen by removing a poorly planned partition wall. The project would take time, perhaps a year or more, but he was in no rush. For once in his life, he wanted to approach something deliberately, without the looming threat of a client's impatience or the push to deliver faster and cheaper. This house was his, and he would restore it properly. As the days passed, Ethan began to notice that the community operated with a degree of uniformity that was both impressive and slightly unsettling. Lawns were trimmed with near-military precision, trash bins were placed at identical intervals along the curb every collection day, and every exterior paint color seemed to fall within the same palette of beige, soft gray, or pale blue. The streets themselves were quiet, almost unnervingly so, especially at night when the glow of porch lights and the occasional hum of a distant television were the only signs of life. He told himself it was just different from the urban background noise he was accustomed to, and for the most part, he appreciated the stillness. Yet there was an undercurrent he couldn't quite place, a sense that the neighborhood's polished appearance came at the cost of something unspoken. He brushed it aside as nerves from the move. Within 2 weeks, Ethan began reaching out to contractors to get bids on the initial phase of the renovation, starting with the roof and electrical work. He also introduced himself to a few of the neighbors whose paths he crossed. Most were polite but brief in conversation, eager to return to their routines. A middle-aged man named Tom from across the street offered a warm smile and a handshake, but quickly excused himself after answering a question about local suppliers. A young mother named Claire, whose toddler clung shyly to her leg, chatted for a moment about schools before glancing at her watch and hurrying away. There was a rhythm to the community that Ethan had yet to penetrate, and while he was comfortable with solitude, he found himself wishing for at least one deeper connection. The letter arrived on a Thursday evening, folded neatly inside his mailbox and marked with the neighborhood's official insignia. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored paper and carried a tone that was polite to the point of being cold. "Dear Mr. Brooks," it began, "please be advised that your upcoming renovation project will need to be reviewed and approved at the next mandatory community meeting. Attendance is required. Failure to attend or comply with the outcome of the review may result in penalties as outlined in our community standards." Ethan read it twice, perplexed. Nowhere in the materials he had reviewed during the purchase process had there been any mention of such a requirement, nor had his real estate agent warned him about mandatory oversight. He understood that many neighborhoods had regulations to maintain property values, but this language felt unusually formal, even threatening. Still, he assumed the meeting would be a routine formality, a chance to explain his plans and reassure the community that he intended to respect the character of the area. On the appointed evening, Ethan arrived at the small community hall located near the entrance of the subdivision. The parking lot was nearly full, and as he stepped inside, he was greeted by rows of folding chairs filled with residents. At the front of the room stood a long table where 5 individuals sat like a panel, papers neatly stacked before them. At the center was a woman in her late 40s with sharp, symmetrical features and a perfectly tailored blazer. She introduced herself as Melissa Carrington, the chair of the community council, and invited Ethan to take a seat in the front row. The meeting began with Melissa outlining the agenda in a tone that brooked no interruption. She spoke of maintenance issues, landscaping initiatives, and the importance of preserving the neighborhood's harmonious aesthetic. When it was Ethan's turn, she asked him to present his renovation plans. He produced the sketches and proposals he had prepared, detailing his intent to restore the home while maintaining its historical integrity. Melissa and the other council members examined the documents in silence, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Melissa cleared her throat and delivered a verdict that left Ethan momentarily stunned. "Your proposal," she said, "does not align with the community's standards. We will not approve it. Instead, we have prepared a revised design that you are required to follow." She slid a set of drawings across the table toward him. Ethan unfolded them to find a bland, cookie-cutter design that stripped the house of nearly all its unique features. Gone were the intricate moldings and custom details he had painstakingly planned to preserve. In their place were standardized windows, a generic porch, and an exterior color that matched half the other houses on the street. "This is unacceptable," Ethan said, his voice measured but firm. "The house is over a century old. Your design erases everything that makes it historically significant." Melissa's expression did not change. "Our priority is consistency," she replied. "We expect you to comply. If you do not, you will face escalating penalties, and the community has the authority to take further action if necessary." Ethan felt the eyes of the entire room on him as he folded the drawings and returned them to the table. He had no intention of abandoning his vision, but he also understood, perhaps for the first time, that the road ahead would be far more difficult than he had anticipated. He left the hall with a tightness in his chest, aware that his new neighbors were watching him, their polite smiles replaced by something harder to define. For the first time since he had moved in, the neighborhood no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a battlefield waiting to be drawn. The days following the community meeting were marked by an unsettling quiet, the kind of stillness that makes one feel as though the air itself is holding its breath. Ethan tried to convince himself that the confrontation at the hall had been little more than a misunderstanding, the kind that might be resolved with a polite conversation, but a gnawing unease settled deep in his chest and refused to leave. He spent the weekend walking the property, making notes on the repairs that still needed attention, but even as he busied himself with measuring floor joists and inspecting loose shingles, he could not shake the sensation of eyes on him. Neighbors who had once waved from their driveways now seemed to avert their gaze when he passed, and a few even crossed the street entirely to avoid any chance encounter. He knew he was not imagining it, and the realization carried with it the bitter taste of exclusion. On Monday morning, Ethan found an envelope shoved haphazardly into his mailbox, this one without the formality of a printed letterhead. The paper was cheap and unsealed, the handwriting jagged as though scrawled in haste. He opened it on the spot and read a single line that made his jaw tighten. "Do what you're told, or you'll regret it." There was no signature, no indication of who had left it there, and though he wanted to believe it was the work of some cowardly crank with too much time on their hands, the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Ethan immediately folded the note and placed it in a plastic sleeve, vowing to keep a record of everything that followed. He was no stranger to conflict. Years of dealing with developers and municipal boards had taught him the importance of documentation, and he knew that evidence could be the difference between winning and losing a battle that was fought not just with words but with paper trails. That afternoon, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table reviewing contractor bids, he received a call from the roofing company he had been planning to hire. The foreman, a gruff but fair man named Ray, sounded unusually tense. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he said, "but we're going to have to pull out of the job. I got a call from someone on your community council this morning. They said if we start work on your property, they'll blacklist us from every project in the neighborhood. That's a lot of business we can't afford to lose." Ethan tried to reason with him, explaining that his renovation plans were perfectly legal and that the council had no authority to interfere, but Ray's tone made it clear that the decision was final. "I'm not saying I agree with it," he added, "but I can't take the risk. I hope you understand." It was the first tangible blow to Ethan's plans, and it left him both angry and alarmed. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps even more letters or fines, but the deliberate targeting of his contractors revealed a level of coordination he had not expected. Within the next 48 hours, 2 other companies followed suit. The electrician who had been scheduled to rewire the outdated system suddenly claimed his calendar was full for the next 6 months, and the landscaping crew he had spoken with stopped answering his calls altogether. Ethan quickly realized that he was being cut off, his ability to move forward with the renovation strangled at the root. Determined not to react rashly, Ethan drove into town and arranged a meeting with a local attorney named Rebecca Klein. Rebecca came highly recommended by a colleague from Boston who had once worked with her on a property dispute, and from the moment Ethan stepped into her office, he sensed he was dealing with someone who understood the quiet brutality of these kinds of conflicts. She listened carefully as he explained the series of events, occasionally asking clarifying questions but otherwise allowing him to recount the details in full. When he produced the threatening note, she placed it in a file and nodded gravely. "You're dealing with a power structure that has learned to operate just shy of the law," she said. "They rely on intimidation and isolation because it works. Most people don't want the fight, so they fold. But if you're willing to stand your ground, there are ways to protect yourself." Rebecca outlined several immediate steps Ethan needed to take. He was to document every interaction, no matter how minor, and keep copies of all correspondence. She advised him to install cameras on the perimeter of his property, not as a means of provocation but as a safeguard against trespassing or vandalism. Most importantly, she would draft a formal letter demanding that the council cease all interference with his contractors and renovation plans, a move that would serve as both a warning and a foundation for potential legal action. "Do not confront them directly," she cautioned. "They will try to provoke you into doing something that makes you look unreasonable. Let me be the one to communicate on your behalf." By the time Ethan left Rebecca's office, he felt a measure of clarity he had been missing for days. He stopped at a hardware store on the way home and purchased several motion-activated cameras, which he spent the evening installing discreetly around his property. He also began a detailed journal, recording the date, time, and nature of every suspicious occurrence, no matter how small. It was a sobering exercise, but it restored a sense of control that the council had been steadily eroding. When the formal letter from Rebecca was delivered 2 days later, He half expected the council to respond with an immediate apology, but instead the pressure intensified. A bright orange citation appeared on his front door one morning, accusing him of failing to maintain his lawn to the community's acceptable standards. The claim was absurd. The grass was neatly trimmed, but the notice carried a fine of $200 and a warning that additional penalties would follow if the issue was not remedied within 7 days. Ethan photographed the lawn and the notice, then sent both to Rebecca, who added them to the growing file. That evening, he discovered that someone had emptied a bag of garbage at the edge of his driveway, its contents spilling across the pavement in a deliberate display of contempt. He cleaned it up in silence, refusing to give whoever was responsible the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. It was during this period of escalating harassment that Ethan began to notice a pattern in his interactions with the neighbors. A few were openly hostile, glaring at him from across the street or whispering to each other when he passed. Others simply avoided him altogether, retreating behind closed doors and drawn curtains. Yet there were subtle signs that not everyone approved of the council's tactics. An elderly man named Mark, whom Ethan had seen tending to his rose bushes on more than one occasion, approached him quietly one afternoon while he was repairing a section of his fence. Mark glanced around nervously before speaking. "You should be careful," he said in a low voice. "They don't stop once they start. They drove the last guy out, and he'd lived here for 20 years. He couldn't take the pressure." When Ethan tried to ask for more information, Mark shook his head. "I've said too much already. Just watch your back." The warning stayed with Ethan long after Mark had retreated into his house. It confirmed what he had suspected all along. He was not dealing with a simple disagreement over aesthetics, but with a systematic effort to break him down and force him to comply. As he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan resolved that he would not be the next person pushed out of his home. He had invested too much, not just financially but emotionally, to surrender to a group of people who valued control over fairness. The road ahead would be difficult, perhaps even dangerous, but for the first time since the conflict began, he felt a steady determination take root. He was ready to fight back, not with anger, but with careful, deliberate action. The following weeks marked a steady intensification of the campaign against Ethan, a slow but deliberate tightening of the noose that left little doubt about the intentions of those who were orchestrating it. The threats, once implied, now manifested in more tangible ways, each incident seemingly calculated to undermine his ability to maintain normalcy. Ethan, who had already begun the practice of documenting everything at the suggestion of his attorney, found himself filling pages of his journal with details that read like the log of a man under siege. On the surface, many of the events might have been dismissed as minor inconveniences, the sort of annoyances that could plague any homeowner, but taken together, the pattern was unmistakable. He knew, without question, that this was an orchestrated effort designed to break him down. One morning he stepped outside to discover that his car, which had been parked in the driveway overnight, was boxed in by two unfamiliar vehicles that had appeared sometime after midnight. There were no drivers in sight, no notes left on windshields, and when he called the non-emergency police line to report the obstruction, the dispatcher informed him that officers could not simply tow the cars unless they were blocking public access. Ethan stood in his driveway for nearly an hour before the vehicles finally disappeared, their engines revving loudly as if mocking his helplessness. He dutifully recorded the license plate numbers and added them to the growing file that Rebecca Klein was maintaining, but he understood that the tactic was effective precisely because it left him with no clear recourse. It was meant to disrupt, to inconvenience, to remind him that he was alone. The following day, he awoke to find a bright red sign staked into his front yard, declaring that the property was under review for code violations and warning all contractors to stay away until the matter was resolved. Ethan ripped it from the ground and photographed it, his hands shaking with frustration. He knew it was a bluff. There had been no official notices from the city and no inspections scheduled, but the sign had the desired effect. Later that afternoon, he received a call from a new contractor he had painstakingly managed to hire after the first wave of the cancellations. The man was apologetic but blunt. "I can't have my crew on a job site that's flagged for violations. We'd get hammered with fines. Call me when it's cleared up." Ethan explained that the sign was fraudulent, but the contractor had already made up his mind. Another project, another delay, another victory for those who were intent on making his renovation impossible. Ethan's frustration grew, but he refused to respond in ways that might be used against him. He followed Rebecca's advice to the letter, remaining outwardly calm and continuing to gather evidence. She had already filed formal complaints with the city, the State Consumer Protection Agency, and even the county prosecutor's office, though she warned him that these processes moved slowly and that he would need to be patient. "What they're hoping," she said during one late-night phone call, "is that you'll lose your temper or make a mistake they can exploit. The fact that you're still standing means you're already a problem for them." Despite his best efforts to remain composed, Ethan could feel the psychological strain mounting. Each day brought new provocations. Garbage dumped in his driveway, anonymous calls in the middle of the night, whispers from neighbors who crossed the street to avoid him. There were moments when he considered the possibility that he might be fighting a battle he could not win, that the sheer weight of the opposition might eventually force him to sell the house and retreat. But each time he entertained the thought, he remembered the words of Mark, the elderly neighbor who had warned him quietly about what had happened to the previous homeowner. He remembered the time and energy he had already invested, the vision he had for restoring the house to its former glory, and the principle that drove him to resist being bullied into submission. Walking away would mean not just losing a home, but abandoning the values he held most deeply. It was in the midst of this turmoil that Ethan received an unexpected visit from Mark himself. The older man appeared at his door one evening just after dusk, his hands buried in the pockets of a weathered jacket. He looked around nervously before speaking. "I don't have much time," he said quietly, "but you need to know something. They're not going to stop. They're planning to hit you with more fines. Maybe even try to get the city involved. I heard Melissa talking to a couple of the council members at the park yesterday. They think if they keep the pressure up long enough, you'll crack." Ethan invited Mark inside, offering him a seat at the kitchen table, but the man shook his head. "I can't stay. If they find out I talked to you, they'll make my life hell too. Just be ready, and don't think they won't try to get to you through other means." Mark's warning unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. He had suspected that Melissa Carrington, the sharp and calculating chair of the council, was the driving force behind the campaign, but hearing confirmation from someone who had overheard her made the threat feel even more personal. He relayed the conversation to Rebecca the next morning, and though she appreciated the information, she reminded him that anonymous statements carried little weight in the eyes of the law. "We need hard evidence," she said. "Documents, recordings, anything that proves they're abusing their authority. Without that, it's your word against theirs." In the days that followed, Ethan began to notice a subtle shift in the tone of the harassment. The tactics became bolder, more aggressive. One evening, as he was returning from a trip to the hardware store, he found his garage door had been forced open and several of his tools scattered across the floor. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, but the violation of his space left him shaken. He reported the incident to the police, who took a statement and promised to increase patrols in the area. But Ethan could see in their eyes that they viewed it as a minor break-in, not a piece of a larger pattern. He installed additional locks and reinforced the garage door, but he knew the message was clear. They could reach him whenever they wanted. Rebecca continued to press forward with the legal complaints, but she also began to discuss a broader strategy. "They're using their control of the neighborhood infrastructure as a weapon," she explained. "If we can disrupt that, even temporarily, it might shift the balance." It was during one of these strategy sessions that Ethan learned of a small but critical detail. The building that served as the council's headquarters, a modest, single-story, Structure near the entrance of the subdivision was not owned outright by the council but leased from a private property management firm. And as Rebecca discovered through a routine records search, the firm had recently placed the building on the market. The listing was quiet, almost deliberately so, but it presented an opportunity that Ethan could not ignore. The idea of purchasing the building himself seemed audacious at first, even reckless, but the more Ethan considered it, the more it made sense. If the council lost access to its headquarters, it would be severely hampered in its ability to coordinate the campaign against him. More importantly, the building likely housed the records and communications that could prove the extent of their misconduct. He discussed the plan with Rebecca at length, weighing the risks and potential benefits, and ultimately decided to move forward. To avoid drawing attention, he arranged for the purchase to be made through a third party, a small LLE Rebecca helped him establish, ensuring that his involvement would remain hidden until the deal was finalized. While the purchase process quietly moved forward, Ethan maintained his routine as best he could, outwardly projecting the image of a man who was determined to weather the storm. But inside, he was acutely aware that the stakes were rising. Melissa and her allies were unlikely to take kindly to any disruption of their control, and he knew that once they discovered what he was doing, the conflict would escalate to an entirely new level. For now, though, he kept his focus on the goal, reminding himself that patience and precision were his greatest weapons. He had no intention of allowing himself to be driven from the home he had worked so hard to claim. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed under pressure. But as the purchase of the council's headquarters edged closer to completion, even he found it increasingly difficult to maintain the mask of normalcy. Each day felt longer than the last, and though he kept up the appearance of quietly continuing his renovation plans, the truth was that every waking hour was devoted to ensuring that the deal went through without any trace of his involvement becoming known. Rebecca handled the majority of the negotiations with the property management firm, skillfully keeping Ethan's name out of the paperwork by using the newly formed LLC as the buyer. Still, there were moments when he could not help but fear that someone would connect the dots before the sale was finalized, that Melissa or one of her confidants would discover his plan and move to stop it before it could be executed. The stress was compounded by the fact that the harassment against him showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had grown worse since Mark's whispered warning. Another fine appeared in his mailbox, this time for excessive exterior clutter, a vague accusation that referred to the neatly stacked lumber and tools he had arranged in his backyard for the renovation. A few days later, a letter arrived claiming that the color of his front door was incompatible with the neighborhood aesthetic, and threatening further penalties if it was not repainted to match the approved palette. Ethan added both documents to the growing file Rebecca was building for the eventual legal case, but the sheer pettiness of the allegations left him shaking his head in disbelief. These people were relentless, and he knew that their goal was not merely to inconvenience him, but to drain him emotionally and financially until he either surrendered or made a mistake they could use to their advantage. Yet, even as the council continued its campaign, Ethan's resolve only hardened. The knowledge that he was on the verge of delivering a blow they could not anticipate gave him a quiet sense of purpose. He kept his movements carefully calculated, never revealing the frustration that simmered beneath the surface, and continued to communicate with Rebecca almost daily as the deal progressed. One afternoon, as they sat in her office reviewing the final documents, she looked up from the stack of papers and said, "Once this closes, they're going to realize what happened very quickly. You need to be prepared for the fallout." Ethan nodded, understanding that the moment the council lost access to its headquarters, the balance of power in the neighborhood would shift dramatically. They would not take that loss lightly. The closing date arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. Ethan chose not to attend in person, instead allowing Rebecca to finalize the purchase on behalf of the LLC, but the weight of the moment was not lost on him. When she called later that afternoon to confirm that the sale had gone through, He felt a surge of relief tempered by the knowledge that the real confrontation was yet to come. That night he barely slept, replaying in his mind the steps he would need to take to secure the building and its contents before the council had an opportunity to interfere. At dawn, he drove to the property with a locksmith and a security contractor, both of whom had been arranged in advance. Within hours, the locks had been changed, a new alarm system installed, and Ethan was holding the keys to a building that, only a week earlier, had been the nerve center of the very group that had tried to crush him. As he walked through the empty halls, the reality of what he had accomplished began to sink in. Filing cabinets lined the walls of the main office, each one neatly labeled with years of records. Computers sat idle on desks, their screens dark, while stacks of correspondence and meeting minutes lay in tidy piles as if the occupants had simply stepped out for lunch and would return at any moment. Ethan knew that within these files lay the evidence he and Rebecca had been seeking, proof of the council's misuse of power, documentation of the fines and threats that had driven other homeowners to capitulate or sell their properties under duress. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt as though he was no longer merely reacting to their actions, but actively dismantling the machinery they had built to enforce their control. But Ethan also understood that possession of the building placed him squarely in their crosshairs. The council would discover soon enough that their headquarters was no longer theirs, and when they did, they would come after him with everything they had left. He left the building that evening with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension, locking the heavy glass doors behind him and setting the alarm with a code known only to him and the security company. He had taken a bold step, one that would almost certainly provoke retaliation, but it was a step he believed necessary to change the trajectory of the conflict. The battle for control of the neighborhood was entering a new phase, and Ethan was no longer content to simply endure. He was ready to fight back, not just for his own sake, but for anyone who had ever been bullied into submission by those who abused their authority. Ethan had known the moment the council discovered the loss of their headquarters would be volatile, but even he could not have anticipated the sheer ferocity of the backlash. It began quietly enough. For the first 24 hours after the locks were changed and the alarm system armed, there was no indication that the council was even aware of what had happened. Ethan went about his day with a deliberate calm, resisting the urge to drive past the building and witness their reaction firsthand. He knew that the longer he could maintain the appearance of ignorance, the better. But by the second day, the first cracks appeared. Melissa Carrington, whose perfectly polished composure had become something of a trademark, appeared at his doorstep unannounced late in the afternoon. She was dressed as impeccably as always, but there was an edge to her voice as she demanded to know whether he had any knowledge of what she referred to as an act of outright theft. Ethan, who had anticipated some version of this confrontation, kept his expression neutral as he replied that he had no idea what she was talking about. "Don't play games with me," Melissa snapped, stepping closer as if she might force the truth out of him by sheer proximity. "We will find out who did this, and when we do, there will be consequences." Ethan's instinct was to shut the door in her face, but instead he calmly asked her to leave his property and warned her that any further unannounced visits would be considered trespassing. Melissa's eyes flashed with anger before she turned on her heel and stormed down the walkway, her heels striking the pavement with sharp, deliberate clicks. Ethan closed the door behind her and exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what he had just set in motion. He called Rebecca immediately and relayed the exchange in detail, and she reminded him once again to avoid direct confrontations. "She wants you to slip up," Rebecca said. "The more you keep your cool, the harder it will be for them to spin this in their favor." But the confrontation at his doorstep was only the beginning. Over the next several days, Ethan found himself the target of an unrelenting campaign designed to make his life as difficult as possible. His mailbox began to overflow with citations, each one accusing him of a new violation: failure to maintain his landscaping, unauthorized exterior modifications, even unapproved use of lighting after a neighbor claimed his porch light was too bright. The fines attached to these notices quickly escalated into the thousands of dollars, and though Ethan knew they were unenforceable without due process, the sheer volume of paperwork was overwhelming. Rebecca assured him that every citation would be added to the mounting legal case against the council, but Ethan could not help but feel a growing sense of siege as the stack of letters grew taller by the day. The harassment soon moved beyond the written word. Ethan awoke one morning to find that the tires on his car had been slashed, forcing him to cancel a meeting with a contractor and spend the day arranging for replacements. Later that week, he discovered that someone had poured an unknown liquid into the gas tank of his backup vehicle, rendering it inoperable. He filed police reports for both incidents, but the officers who responded offered little more than sympathy and vague promises to keep an eye on things. Ethan could tell from their expressions that they viewed the situation as a neighborhood squabble rather than a coordinated campaign of intimidation. It was a frustrating reality, but one he had no choice but to accept. He doubled down on his security measures, adding additional cameras to cover blind spots around the property and reinforcing his garage with heavy-duty locks, but he knew that no amount of hardware could completely insulate him from the hostility that had taken root around him. What surprised Ethan most during this period was how many of his neighbors seemed to be complicit in the harassment, whether actively or through their silence. People who had once offered polite greetings now looked at him with open disdain, and he began to notice whispered conversations that would abruptly end when he approached. It was clear that Melissa and her allies had succeeded in painting him as a villain, someone who was undermining the stability and harmony of the neighborhood. But not everyone appeared convinced. On more than one occasion, Ethan caught a glimpse of Mark watching from his porch with an expression of quiet concern, and once, while Ethan was unloading groceries from his car, a woman he barely recognized slipped him a small envelope containing a handwritten note. "You're not the first they've done this to," the note read. "Don't give up." There was no signature, no indication of who had written it, but the simple message was enough to remind Ethan that he was not entirely alone. By the end of the second week, the council's desperation had become palpable. Unable to access their former headquarters and increasingly aware that Ethan was not going to capitulate, Melissa convened an emergency meeting in one of the neighborhood parks, rallying as many residents as she could. Ethan learned of the gathering only after receiving a barrage of text messages from Rebecca, who had been tipped off by another homeowner. "They're making this public now," Rebecca warned. "She's trying to frame you as the aggressor." Ethan resisted the temptation to attend the meeting in person, knowing it would play directly into Melissa's hands, but he could not help but feel the sting of exclusion as he watched groups of neighbors file past his house on their way to the park. Later, Rebecca shared excerpts from a recording of the meeting provided by an anonymous attendee, and the rhetoric Melissa used was even more inflammatory than Ethan had imagined. She accused him of hostile actions against the community, insinuated that he had seized the council's building through underhanded means, and suggested that his renovation plans would irreparably damage the character of the neighborhood. The crowd's response was mixed, with some residents cheering and others remaining silent, but Melissa had succeeded in escalating the conflict to a new level. In the midst of this storm, Ethan and Rebecca decided it was time to make a decisive move. They had already begun cataloging the contents of the former council headquarters, carefully reviewing the files and digital records left behind, and what they found was even more damning than they had anticipated. The documents revealed a pattern of systematic abuse, fines levied without proper notice, properties intentionally targeted for foreclosure, and evidence of close financial ties between Melissa and a small group of investors who had profited from the forced sales. It was exactly the kind of evidence Rebecca had said they needed, proof that the council's campaign against Ethan was part of a broader scheme that had harmed multiple homeowners. "This is enough to take to the authorities," Rebecca said as they pored over the files late one night. "But we need to be strategic. If we go too early, they'll have time to circle the wagons. We need to make sure that when we strike, there's no room for them to wriggle out." Ethan agreed, but he also knew that waiting carried its own risks. Melissa was growing increasingly unpredictable, and he feared what she might do once she realized that the contents of the building could expose her. His fears were confirmed one evening when he returned home to find a brick lying on his porch, a piece of paper wrapped around it with a single message scrawled in bold black letters. Last chance. Leave. Ethan called the police immediately, but as with the previous incidents, there was little they could do beyond filing a report. He saved the note, photographed the scene, and sent everything to Rebecca, who assured him that each act of intimidation would only strengthen their case. Still, the incident left him rattled. He could no longer ignore the possibility that Melissa or her allies might escalate beyond property damage and threats. The tipping point came 2 nights later when Ethan was awakened by the sound of shattering glass. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bed and rushed downstairs, heart pounding, only to find that one of the front windows had been smashed. There was no one outside by the time he reached the porch, but the damage was unmistakable and the message it conveyed was chillingly clear. This was no longer about fines or paperwork, it was about fear. Ethan called the police once again, and this time he insisted that they send a patrol car to take a full statement. When the officers arrived, he walked them through the incident, pointing out the cameras that had captured the sound of footsteps retreating into the night. He knew the footage would be grainy and inconclusive, but it was another piece of the puzzle, another data point that showed the pattern of harassment he was enduring. Rebecca, upon hearing the latest development, made the call that Ethan had been waiting for. "It's time," she said firmly. "We have enough. I'm going to the district attorney's office tomorrow with the entire file. Once they see what we've uncovered, they'll have no choice but to act." Ethan felt a surge of relief, tempered by the knowledge that the days ahead would be difficult. He knew Melissa and her allies would not go quietly, and he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation. But for the first time in months, he felt as though the momentum had shifted. He was no longer simply defending himself against a faceless enemy. He had the evidence, the strategy, and the support he needed to take the fight to them. And this time, he would not stop until the entire truth was laid bare. The day that Ethan had long feared finally arrived with a sense of inevitability. The pressure had been building for weeks, each new incident of harassment, each new threat, each new provocation leading to the same conclusion. It was no longer just a matter of personal integrity or standing his ground. This had become a fight for his home, his future, and his belief in the principle of fairness. That morning, as he reviewed the documents Rebecca had meticulously compiled, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He knew that what was at stake was far greater than just his own fight against the council. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure what he had been through. As the phone rang, signaling Rebecca's call, the weight of the decision ahead pressed down on him with suffocating clarity. "Ethan, it's time," Rebecca said. Her voice was calm, but there was a note of urgency beneath the surface. "I've spoken with the district attorney. We have their support. This is the moment we've been preparing for. If we don't act now, the council will try to bury everything before it even gets to court." Ethan nodded, though she couldn't see him. He had been preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, a sense of cold clarity overtook any lingering uncertainty. It was no longer a matter of self-preservation, or whether he could endure. He had crossed that line weeks ago when he decided to fight back. This was about the larger picture, about exposing the corruption that had taken root in his neighborhood and ensuring that it could not spread further. He met Rebecca in her office, a place that had become a refuge of sorts throughout the ordeal, a space where he could focus and strategize in relative peace. The air in the office felt thick with anticipation, the papers spread out before them representing not just a legal case, but a call to action. As they discussed the next steps, Rebecca's assistant entered, holding a large envelope. It was time. The district attorney's office had agreed to back their case and was prepared to issue subpoenas for the council's records, including documents that would expose the full extent of their manipulation and illegal practices. Ethan felt a quiet surge of satisfaction as Rebecca handed him the envelope, his fingers briefly brushing against hers as she slid it across the table. This was the moment when everything would change. The plan was simple, yet risky. They would file the lawsuit, requesting an injunction that would immediately halt the council's activities and prevent any further retaliatory actions against Ethan while the investigation was underway. The district attorney's office had already informed them that they had connections within the local police who would ensure that any attempts to intimidate or harm Ethan would be met with swift intervention. It was a calculated risk, one that could either destroy the council's grip on the neighborhood or, if mishandled, ignite a confrontation that would draw unwanted attention and legal challenges. But Ethan had no illusions left about the nature of his opponents. They had already proven that they would stop at nothing to protect their own interests, and he understood that this fight would not end until one side had been completely removed from the equation. As the lawsuit was filed and the injunction was requested, Ethan's role shifted from passive victim to active combatant. He was no longer merely enduring. He was driving the fight, using the council's own illegal activities against them. Within days, the media began to take notice. A local journalist, tipped off by an anonymous source within the district attorney's office, published an investigative piece on the council's corrupt practices. The article detailed the way the council had manipulated property values, issued illegal fines, and conspired with investors to force homeowners into selling their properties at a fraction of their worth. It didn't take long for the story to go viral. Within hours, Ethan's name became synonymous with the fight for justice in their small, affluent community. People who had once avoided him or whispered behind his back now reached out with messages of support, with stories of their own dealings with the council's ruthless tactics. The groundswell of the public opinion began to shift in Ethan's favor, and as the story spread, the council's once unassailable power began to erode. But it was not all smooth sailing. The backlash from Melissa and the council's supporters was swift and brutal. At one point, Ethan found himself facing a new set of threats, more direct and more dangerous than any before. Late one night, as he was reviewing the latest batch of documents at his kitchen table, he heard a loud bang from the direction of his garage. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately grabbed the phone, dialing Rebecca's number. The call went straight to voicemail. He hung up and moved quickly toward the door, his mind racing with possibilities. When he stepped outside, he saw the flashing lights of a police car and the outline of an officer standing near his garage. The door was open, and inside, the tools and equipment he had stored were strewn across the floor in disarray. "Someone broke in," the officer said when Ethan arrived. "It's hard to tell what was taken, but there's definite signs of forced entry." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he surveyed the scene. The message was unmistakable. They were trying to intimidate him into backing down, using threats of violence and property destruction to make him feel unsafe in his own home. But it was a mistake to think that Ethan could be cowed so easily. He remained calm as the officer took notes, assuring him that he would file a report and that they would investigate the matter, though Ethan knew it would amount to little more than bureaucracy in motion. His mind was already focused on what he needed to do next. He took a deep breath, letting the anger simmer beneath the surface, and reminded himself that this fight was not about emotions. It was about winning. The police report was filed, and the next morning, Rebecca arrived at his house with fresh developments. The district attorney's office had subpoenaed the council's financial records, and what they had uncovered was nothing short of shocking. The council's dealings with local real estate investors were far deeper and more extensive than anyone had imagined. It was no longer just a matter of Ethan's home being targeted. The entire neighborhood had been systematically manipulated, its properties undervalued and sold to investors for a fraction of their worth, all while the council members profited under the table. There was no longer any room for doubt. This was corruption at its most blatant, and Ethan's fight had gone from being personal to something much larger. It was about exposing the network of deceit that had controlled the neighborhood for far too long. As the news of the council's misdeeds spread, more and more residents came forward, some offering testimony, others providing documents that corroborated Ethan's findings. The momentum shifted in their favor, and the once unified front of the council began to fracture. Melissa Carrington, who had once held the reins with an iron grip, found herself cornered. As the district attorney's office prepared to press charges, she tried to salvage what remained of her power by offering a settlement, but it was too little, too late. The damage had been done, and the public had made its judgment. The council's reign of terror was over. In the end, Ethan's victory was not just a personal triumph over those who had sought to destroy him, but a victory for the community as a whole. The council was dismantled, its members removed from power and replaced by a new, transparent leadership that prioritized fairness and respect for the rights of homeowners. Ethan, though reluctant to step into the spotlight, became a symbol of resistance and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was possible to fight back against corruption. As he stood in front of his restored home, watching as the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, he knew that the battle had been hard-fought, but it had been worth every moment of it. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan could finally exhale, knowing that the home he had worked so hard to preserve was no longer just a structure. It was a symbol of the power of one person standing against the tide. The days after the victory were a strange mixture of relief and disbelief for Ethan. The fight that had consumed his life for months was over, yet the scars it had left behind still lingered, reminding him of how close he had come to losing not just his home, but his sense of self. As the new council members took their positions and began to rebuild the community from the ashes of the old regime, Ethan found himself navigating a new kind of normal. The heavy weight of constant fear and harassment had lifted, replaced by a quieter, more peaceful existence. Neighbors who had once looked at him with suspicion or hostility now greeted him with tentative smiles, some offering apologies for their prior silence, while others simply nodded in acknowledgement of what he had done. It was clear that his actions had left a mark on the entire neighborhood, but the nature of that mark remained uncertain, as though the community was still unsure of how to reconcile what had happened with their previous understanding of order and authority. Ethan had never considered himself a revolutionary. He had simply wanted to restore his home, to turn it into something that reflected his vision and skill, but the events that had unfolded over the past several months had turned him into something of a symbol. People began to approach him with stories of their own grievances, whispering about the ways in which they had been wronged by the council, the quiet corruption that had festered in the shadows of their suburban enclave. They spoke of how they had been forced to comply with unreasonable demands, how their lives had been upended by the council's manipulations. But now, there was a sense of hope in their voices, a belief that things could change. Ethan listened, offering advice when he could, but he was careful not to make himself a martyr. He had done what he had done because it was the right thing to do, not because he sought adoration or applause. At the heart of it all, however, was a sense of calm that had eluded him for so long. His home, once a symbol of conflict and struggle, had become a sanctuary again, a place of quiet solitude where he could finally breathe without the constant pressure of impending disaster. The renovations he had started, initially so fraught with obstacles, now stood as a testament to his resilience and determination. The house, with its freshly painted trim and restored features, had become the embodiment of everything he had fought for: preservation, integrity, and a refusal to let injustice go unchallenged. He spent his evenings sitting on the front porch, watching the world go by as the light of the setting sun bathed the neighborhood in a soft golden glow. For the first time in what felt like years, he could enjoy the simple pleasures of life without the ever-present shadow of fear looming over him. But, even as the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm, Ethan knew that the echoes of the past would continue to reverberate for some time. The fallout from the council's removal was far from over. Melissa Carrington, who had once held so much power and influence, found herself publicly disgraced, her actions exposed for all to see. Though she had initially tried to spin the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding, The evidence against her was irrefutable. As the public backlash grew, she was forced to resign from her position and face an ongoing investigation into her role in the council's corruption. There were rumors of criminal charges, of financial misconduct, and even whispers of her potential involvement in more nefarious dealings. But for Ethan, it was enough that she had been held accountable. The damage she had done to the community could never be fully undone, but the process of healing had begun, and that was all that mattered. Melissa's downfall had sparked a shift in the entire neighborhood. As the new council members took office and began their work, there was a palpable sense of optimism, a renewed commitment to transparency and fairness. The community, once fractured by fear and manipulation, slowly began to rebuild itself on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Ethan found himself occasionally attending the new council meetings, though he kept to the background, never seeking the spotlight. He was content to watch from the sidelines as the neighborhood began to heal, knowing that his actions had played a pivotal role in creating the change that was now taking root. One evening, as he walked through the park near his home, he was approached by Mark, the elderly neighbor who had been a quiet source of support throughout the ordeal. Mark, who had been one of the few to reach out to Ethan during the darkest days of the fight, now seemed more at ease, his expression warm and sincere. "I never thought I'd see the day," Mark said, his voice tinged with both relief and respect. "You've done something no one else had the courage to do. The whole neighborhood owes you a debt." Ethan shook his head, feeling uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't do it for thanks," he replied, his voice steady. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Mark smiled, clapping him on the back. "That's the thing, isn't it? Some people only care about what they can get out of it. But you just wanted to make things right." The sincerity in his voice struck a chord with Ethan, and for a moment he was speechless, unsure how to respond. He had never sought recognition for his actions, but in that moment, he realized that the recognition wasn't as important as the change that had been brought about. He had done what was right, not for accolades or praise, but because he believed in justice, in fairness, and in the power of standing up against what was wrong. As the weeks passed, Ethan continued to rebuild not just his home but his place in the community. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined him. The neighborhood, too, was healing, slowly but surely, as residents took ownership of their own roles in maintaining the balance that had been restored. The new council, though still in its infancy, began to engage with the residents in a way that the previous regime never had. Transparency became the cornerstone of their governance, and the lines of communication between the council and the community were opened wide. There were no longer any hidden agendas, no more secrets lurking in the shadows. What had once been a quiet, well-manicured neighborhood was now a place where residents were active participants in the decisions that affected their lives, a place where power was no longer concentrated in the hands of a few, but shared by all. Ethan stood on his porch one evening, watching the neighborhood come to life around him.